All right, this is gonna be my little session for you, Leo. Hopefully, this helps. So, I remember you saying that you wanted help with melodies, right? If I remember correctly, in regards to how I make my melodies sound full and expansive and just very lush and kind of all over the place in a good way. So, this video is gonna be aimed to help with that. Hopefully, you can learn something from this. So, this is a little section from my track that I'm working on. Uh, Forgot the full name. Session Nekari. That's kind of like what I'm sticking with right now because I still haven't decided on like an exact name for this track yet. And this little part is actually going to be from the first, I guess you could say, kind of drop. It's the climax of the song, at least in the first half of it. And what I have right now is just a piano, but I think it'll be great for explaining because it's very cohesive and there's not too much to go over. Ignore this release cut art. This is just something I added for myself later. This isn't going to be important. You're only going to need to focus on these three layers, and I'm going to explain what they're doing, why they work together, and how you can translate this into your own style of music and with other instruments. So let's go over the individual layers, right? We have the lower chords, the top chords, and the top melody. So why do I have these three different layers, right? So the lower chords, these are essentially my bass notes. These chords right here are just root notes bumped down an octave each, right? So it's one octave, another octave. So this isn't like any music theory. This is just the root notes with more root notes under it to give it more weight and kind of give it a foundation. Um, that's just a foundation for what I'm doing. This isn't necessarily too important, but depending on the context of your track, you do want to consider how your melody plays in relation to your bass. Whether it's like just a general bass line or just like lower range notes, if that makes sense. Right here we have the top chords. So this is where I'm playing actual chords. Um, Now, one thing I do want you to be aware of is that in this song in particular, I am using a bit of jazz harmony. So it's not going to stick to your standard idea of what a chord is going to be. It's kind of just going to be whatever sounds good, and it might even be out of scale at some points. All of these are in scale and the scale of, was it E flat major? Yeah, D sharp, E flat major. And then we have the bottom layer. This is the top melody. So these are going to have different sounds. These are going to sound a bit darker. They're not going to be as bright because they're in the lower register, right? They're lower on the frequency spectrum. The top chords are going to be a bit above that, but they're going to be brighter, but they're not going to be overtaking anything. They're just kind of stacked on top of the lower chords to bring out more life into it and actually bring out some contrast. Because these chords themselves aren't too bright. So this is going to give the track more texture. And then the top melody, of course, is kind of the direction, the movement. So now let's actually go and listen to it. These are the lower chords, right? And this is just 8 bars, but this is what we're going to stick with. So very basic, right? These chords are the fourth, fifth, and sixth in the scale. It's a chord progression and root note progression that I like a lot because it just works in so many types of music, and it's really good for this kind of like storytelling cinematic style. You'll actually hear it in a lot of anime music and like anime like openings and endings and stuff like that. I'm sure you've heard this somewhere before, even if you don't recognize it. So nothing too crazy there, right? It's a little bit darker, but it's a foundation, right? So here's my top chords. Oh, gotta solo this. So this is a little bit brighter, and what I'm doing here is kind of just trying to give a bit more movement while kind of still focusing on creating a sort of mood and letting the actual top melody play some movement. But there is more movement in here because this is in a higher register, so I can get away with it a bit more, and it kind of helps to add a little bit more texture. Now, originally, I'm going to show you what it sounded like before. We're going to take away some of these notes, these thirds. So this is what it sounded like before. You couldn't tell? The bottom notes and the top notes, they're just an octave apart, right? This isn't a set of chords necessarily. However, I guess you could consider chords. What I did do is I added some thirds and some parts. So I took some notes on the lower part, on the lower octave, and I copied them a third apart. Why I did this? So in music theory, they teach you the basic triad, right? You know, when you're studying music theory, the first thing you learn about is the basic triad: the first, the third, and the fifth. My major third and minor third, you know, depending on the scale, more often than not, will give you like your third placement, right? So I'm not too focused on the placement necessarily of the third, as in like, you know, what it sounds like. I am, but I'm not. Okay, so let me kind of simplify that. I'm not too worried about whether it's major or minor, but it's more so the weight. So part of why I put thirds here and some of these areas is because I wanted to give them some more weight. So this sounds kind of empty, right? But this part sounds really light and airy, so I don't want too much weight to this. I want this to kind of suspend the hold over some tension, right? So if I add these thirds, it makes this sound a lot brighter because of this darker tone right here. It's not necessarily like darker, but it's a bit heavier, right? And then so we play from here. Again, this is kind of suspended, but this is also very like bent full. And it's a little bit darker. So I want some more weight to it to kind of carry it over. Same here. This is resolving, right? So this is on the sixth of the scale, which can kind of be used as a form of resolve. So different parts of the scale have different levels of, how did I say this? Different notes in the scale have different kind of values. The reason why I use the 4, 5, and 6 in the chord progression and the root note progression is because it's really good for building tension. And the first note and the first and the sixth in the scale are usually where you resolve tension. That's what you resolve on. 6 usually being the brighter version. But because this is going down, but also on the sixth, I kind of want to give it some weight, especially because I like how this sounds on its own. Very nice. But we have this. It's got a nice feel to it. And this isn't one of those things that's like carefully meticulated or articulate. This is one of the things I kind of just played around with because I know adding thirds is really important. Because when you think about triads, the third is the emotional tone in the chord. The fifth is kind of just for balance. The first is your root note. Like, so let's say, you know, you want to play, let's play, for example, let's just take a random set of chords, right? Let's take a major, what is this? Okay, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is a major fifth, right? Um, so this is what we have, right? Oh, that's way too high. Lower it a bit. This is what we have, right? This is what the major fifth, or this like perfect fifth major triad on the fifth, right? This is a major fifth in the scale of E flat major. So let's take out some chords to kind of show you what I mean. We take out the third, without the third. It lacks some, you know, emotion to it. Let's take out the fifth. It sounds about the same, but we add the fifth. It just makes it slightly brighter as for stability. And we take the first out. Completely different sound because this is actually a minor triad without the fifth. But if we invert the first, now we have an inverted major fifth. And inversions just means taking the root note and taking it up one octave. That's all that really means. So the point is, the third is most of the emotional weight in melodies and chords. The reason I'm bringing this up for melodies is because you can add thirds to certain parts of a melody to give them more weight or more strength in a certain emotional context. And part of why I think this works so much is because even though I'm adding them a third apart, the original notes that I started with is the actual third. I'm basically adding another root note, and then I'm adding a third, and then I'm octavating the third up, so I'm carrying that emotion throughout. That's why this is so much stronger emotionally is because I have layered a third while giving it strong presence. And that's just the top chord. So let's go back to, let me turn this back on real quick. Now let's go to the top melody. This is what it sounds like. So having a little bit of fun with that, right? So let's kind of break this down a little bit. So let's try to understand what makes a melody, right? Let's go over some basic structure. I'm sure you probably already know this, but for the sake of context, I'm going to go through this real quick, right? So the basic structure of a melody is called a motif. This is my motif right here. And then this is like a call and response structure. And then again, repeat the motif. Motif repeats again. Extra note, kind of just for some variation. Motif, call and response. Motif, call. This is like, the call, then answer, call, answer. And then this is just kind of a little bridge. This is just something I added on my own. And just one of the things I like to play around with because I just think it sounds really neat. Because it's going to bridge into the second half of this phrasing. Because the song's going to kind of open up and this is going to take over most of the part of the song right there, right? It's kind of just like, it's like a little drum fill for melodies, if that makes sense. And then these notes are kind of just more supporting notes. They give a nice little contrast. This is what it sounds like without them. Sounds pretty neat in my opinion, but I added them again, kind of just for some weights. Also, if you notice, these are kind of unevenly placed. They are syncopated, whereas so these are in eighth notes, right? These are 3/8 out of a single bar, right? And so it takes up 6 notes with some space in between. So the space that I leave in between to give a kind of a break in the melody, so it's not playing too much or too aggressive. These are playing. These aren't necessarily like bass notes. These are more just kind of like support that sound kind of neat. Give it the movement. The track's moving up, so I make these move up. The melody moves down, these come down. And then I had these move down in contrast to this moving up. Mostly just because, again, I like the way it sounds. That's going to be a recurring theme. If you like the way it sounds, probably good. Um, and so that's the basic structure. Now, why is the melody the way it is? Well, one part is I want this kind of sense of rising tension, right? So that's why this is rising. When you want something to have more tension, generally it's going to be building up or it's going to have some heavy bass notes on it. But because this isn't, these aren't chords, right? This isn't playing bass notes. And even if this was playing chords, these wouldn't be bass chords, right? So these are going to generally be building up because if they're going to be going down, it's going to sound a lot darker and it's not going to give me the kind of texture and emotion that I want. But you could do that. But for the sake of this track, we're not going to go too much into that. As for the melody itself, so we've gone over structure and kind of how it moves and why, right? So how does this all play together and why is it the way that it is, right? So let's play it. Let's play the lower chords and then we'll add elements. These are the lower chords. And then that'll repeat. And so that's rising tension, right? Because that's the theme of this drop right here, right? That's what I want to have. That's what I want to be apparent within this track is there's going to be this kind of sense of rising tension, even though this is essentially the climax, because I'm trying to hold on to a lot of energy because that's just what I'm aiming for. I want this track to feel like it's kind of, it's alive in a way, and there's this sort of anxious feel to it. So now let's add the top chords. And this is not necessarily syncopated, but there's a little bit more burst of movement within these chords. If you don't know what syncopated means or syncopation, it basically just means playing offbeat. So let's say you have a 4 on the floor kind of beat, right? Like a do cha do cha. Syncopation would mean your melody or your bass line is not playing with that. So like let's say you have a kick here, kick, snare on every one of these bars, right? Um, on these fourths. Let's yeah, one. Why does it look like that? I feel like I'm confusing myself. I'm not in triplets, am I? I am. Okay, that's why I was confusing myself. Okay, I had triplet grid on for some reason. Okay, so like let's say kick, there's a kick here, kick here, snare here, right? But in the middle of these is where your bass notes or your melodic elements might start playing more. That's what syncopation is. It's not hitting on beat with like the kick and snare, it's kind of just playing in these bursts where it feels very, it's not in sync, but it gives it groove, right? Like, for example, if you want a really good groove with liquid drum and bass and stuff like that, a lot of your percussive elements outside of your kick and snare are not going to be playing off your kick and snare entirely. Or if they are, they're going to be mainly played in little short bursts, like it's like a doo cha, doo cha. In between that kick and snare, you're going to have little sounds with your top ends and all that, right? So that's what syncopation is. But back to the actual melodic elements, right? So here's the lower chords and the top chords. Now we have some movement and a brighter tone. So we got that there, right? So now we have some movement, and this is brighter, and it's kind of adding some contrast. And then we're getting a bit more of the emotion that we want. Now let's add the top melody. This is where all our movement's going to be, and this is going to give us a lot more flavor. You can't rely solely on the melody for all of this, but you do have to understand that it is the driving force. So it does need to have cohesion with it. This is why I usually start with my bass chords, give them some more movement, and then start with this. And then I eventually get to my top melody. In other words, the brightest element, the kind of like the element that's going to get the most amount of spotlight and attention, right? So here it is. Here's the full melodic element. Stretch this out for a little bit of room. Right here. All right, here we go. So that's what I have right now. This might be subject to change, but I think this encompasses most of what I wanted to go across. So, as for how this can translate into your own music, right? You might not necessarily be too worried about the chords themselves, but you're probably thinking, okay, so how can I take, these like nice full melodies that feel really warm and inviting and just very expansive, because I'm kind of just trying to quote what I thought you said. I don't remember off the top of my head. Um, let's look at this through the perspective of like a track by Faint, for example, right? I think part of why his melodies work is because they use, how do I say this? I write different kind of melodies than him. Our melodic styles are not remotely similar, as far as I'm aware, especially with this kind of element. But if you're using synths like this, the key point is that you do have to have some sort of motif, and oftentimes you're going to find yourself looking at this like a call and response, which is going to be playing off of the bass notes to create either some form of syncopation or groove, which I think is ideal. And the most important factor into creating these catchy melodies is to have stuff that's not super in sync, because then it feels very robotic, static, and it loses flavor. But this movement doesn't follow the chords at all, but using some cohesion between the elements and building them off of each other, I've been able to add a motif and call and response that plays off the chords the way that I want, because I focused on creating the mood, right? So let's say in one of your tracks, right, you have your bass line, you have your major elements, right? You have your kick snare, you have other percussive elements, you have your bass line, maybe some mid basses, and you have some warm elements like a lead or something, for example, right? Which would be thinking, okay, but what if I don't have a lead yet? Well, here's what I would do: is think to myself, okay, well, what kind of sound am I going for? What kind of vibe am I trying to write for the song, right? And don't look at it as like, okay, well, I'm trying to write dance floor or like a softer liquid. Like that's going to be part of your writing thought process, yes. But the more important part is for you to look at your more like broad elements, right? Your bass, your drums, your foundation for your track, and think to yourself, okay, do I want this to be really groovy? Do I want this to kind of be more smoothed out, right? Figure it out what it is you want your melody to do and then play around that. If you want it groovy, give it short syncopated bursts like this. If you don't want that and you want it more kind of in tune, play something that's more like these top chords, which is perfectly fine. And in a lot of styles of drum and bass, this is actually preferred for a lot of people because this is more in tune, especially for dance floor. Or you combine them both with the groovier melody being a bit more subtle for kind of like a backdrop. And I think in a lot of drum and bass, and specifically your kind of music, this would actually be better for you. And this works with all sorts of elements. This can be a lead. This can be a pluck. This can also be a lead. This could be something plucky that's arpeggiated. There's a lot of things you can do. It just depends on what you want in context. You got to think about why you want it to do this, right? You might not necessarily know what you want the track to be doing just quite yet. So try to just start somewhere and build off of that. That's how you get your cohesion between your elements melodically is build them around each other. And it seems complicated and you're like, "Well, I want to do this, but I don't know how to do this." The simplest answer to fixing that is just starting and sometimes reverse engineering it. Maybe get the kind of melody that you want, find something that's nice, and then put something under it or on top of it that you feel like you either want as a lead that's you've got this perfect texture and you just need a lead over it, go find a nice lead sound. If you've got this nice lead but not the kind of texture you want, just look for plugs, look for like sound design something, just throw something out there. This is how you're going to create these more full and wide melodies. Now, if you want to make them even more expansive and all this, that's more of a mixing thing, but obviously reverb, delay, panning, all that, right? Let's say for these elements, I want to make them a bit more rich, right? So here's my piano. Here's what it sounds like again. That's what it sounds like normally. But I actually want to use a bit of delay on here because I want this to be a little bit brighter, and I'm going to put the delay on the chords and then leave the top melody as kind of more plucky. To make a more plucky piano, if you ever want to use this, this is my piano plugin, True Pianos, like $60 US. A little bit, that can be a little bit pricey, but I highly recommend it. I personally love this. I've been using it for a long time now. Set the release on your piano to about. Normally, you set it as low as you can to 0. You want to do it just slightly higher so you don't get this clickiness. And it gives you something like this. So here's the top melody normally. This is what it would normally sound like. It kind of holds that. But if we cut out almost all of the release, you get this kind of more plucky sound, which I really like. There's reverb on it that I added to give it a bit more, I guess, roominess and air to it. However, a release cut piano. This is, in case you've never heard a release cut piano, this is what it is, and I highly recommend you play with these. They're super fun, and it can also be good just for melodic practice. So this is what it's going to sound like in total with some added effects, right? Okay, so I have my delay on, EQ, all that. Turning off the delay on this because I actually don't want delay on this one. Actually, I will leave it there just in case I want to turn it back on. But for now, it's going to sound like this. And see, just by adding delay, I actually added some groove and made this sound more full and wide. That's just a little mixing thing. I guess this is less of a mixing thing and more of a post processing thing, a way to improve the sound. So as I'm writing it, I can fill it in and it doesn't sound as dry. Sometimes I think it's important to have your post processing done after a small portion of your melodic elements are built. So you know what you want. Like if you know you want your song to sound like this and you got in this kind of right texture or sound for an element, right? You're like, I know I want this to play throughout the song or at least play through most of the song, right? I think it's important to actually write with that in mind a lot of times because it can lead to you realizing, okay, maybe this doesn't sound too good because if I play something like this too much over here in these top chords or in these more kind of like slower paced melodic elements, it's going to sound kind of weird because it's all over the place. But because these are more drawn out, I can give them a little bit of groove and make them feel more full and wide. And then with this being brighter but more solid and playing off of this, this plays more like a sparkling texture, if anything, just as the lower chords do. Therefore, filling this out. And these three elements alone, just different layers of the piano, fill out so much of the main elements of the song while still leaving plenty of room because they're harmonically rich, but they don't take up too much because they're each in their own register. Because these are almost exclusively in the bass and the mids. These are a bit more in the top end, and these are very much in the top end and bright. So they each have their place as well. That's the last thing I have to say in regards to writing good melodies is you got to understand you need to understand where they're going to be. Like your more plucky elements are always going to be in the higher frequencies because they have to be. They need to be. Because if you want to have melodic elements that play a lot, they can't be on the lower end because they're going to have too much weight to them. So it's going to make the mix sound very muddy and it's going to take up too much space in the song, right? Like, for example, when you're writing in the notes for your sub bass, your root notes, right? They're very long and drawn out like this. They're not moving around a lot. And the reason why is because they shouldn't be, because it's going to make the song sound very dirty, not like in the like cool bass way, but it's going to sound very messy. So they do need to have their own space, and these are very intentionally put into their own space. That's part of why this works as it does. I guess there is one last little piece of advice I'll say before I end this. The most important thing you need to consider when writing melodies is, I don't know if this is the most important, but this is something you need to be aware of. When you're using synths, you don't really think about how people would play it on an instrument because generally it's not being played on, an acoustic instrument or an electric instrument. It's not a physical, tangible one. It's a synthesizer, right? It's a computer generated sound, so it can play all sorts of different notes at one time, right? If you want your if you want your melodies to sound cohesive and just if you want them to make sense, right? Don't spread your notes out too far. That's the biggest mistake you can make is spreading your notes out too far. Like, let's say I'm playing, let's go to this melody right here, right? Let's say I play this first note, right? I don't want to jump to like straight. I don't want to jump to just like straight down here, right? Maybe like kind of here. You really don't want to be jumping more than a few steps at a time, whole steps, half steps, right? Maybe like 5 or 6 at most, because it's going to sound like too much of a sudden change. Maybe with arpeggiated elements, you could do that, but with your main melodic elements, it's going to sound incredibly off, especially just because it doesn't feel like it's smooth. It doesn't feel like it's gliding. And I think for your kind of music, that's the most important part is finding that smooth glide that keeps things kind of groovy, but also just kind of like almost euphoric where it just gets people in that good mood, like your music generally does. So, with that being said, that's my little tutorial on how I write my melodies and what I know about them, right? If you have any other questions, feel free to ask, put them there. Watch this as many times as you need. And most importantly, did not mean to do that. Most importantly, just take your time with this. Try to understand why you're doing what you're doing afterwards, but act with intent. You don't always need to understand why you're doing what you're doing in the moment. But if you want to learn how to write better stuff, look at what you're writing and try to figure out why it works. Because when you write something good and it just kind of works, you'll know why if you go and look at it. And if you have any questions in regards to like music theory aspects and like, so when I was talking about, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, all this, like, what does it mean? What's its place in the scale? Why is this like the resolving note? Why do these kind of evoke these sort of emotions? I'm not the most knowledgeable on those, but I can give you some answers. So if you have any questions, again, feel free to ask. And hopefully this teaches you a lot. I know this is a lot, but I figured I'd go into detail because this is something I'm passionate about and I don't want to sugarcoat it. I want to give you exactly what you want to hear. And hopefully after you watching this a few times, you'll understand what you need, right? So before I end this is going to be my quick little synopsis of how I build stuff real quick so you can kind of follow a formula, right? Just something to start out, right? Create a foundation, create some rhythm, create some movements. The most important thing in writing good melodies is to make sure you have your foundation, you have some sort of supporting element, and then you have something to take over, right? You have a lead, you have your bass, and then you have your support. Let's just call these drums, for example, right? There will be drums in this part of the song, but it's not going to be important for this lesson. So foundation, supporting elements in lead. That's the three elements you need to keep an eye on, and you can build those in any order you want. You just have to kind of reverse engineer from wherever you start, right? Engineer, reverse engineer. If you start with the foundation, work your way up. If you start with your lead or your supporting elements, build around that. You can very much start with supporting elements, but I would recommend starting with the lead or the bass because that's usually going to be the most amount of flavor for your song. And then support is kind of just bridging these two pieces, right? So hope that finds you well, and have yourself a good day.